Hello, welcome to Promises. So, by the end of this lesson, I hope you will be able to explain how promises work. So we've been using these quite a bit, mostly with fetch, but we really haven't talked about what a promise is or how it functions. And now that you've used them a bit, I think it might help to peek under the hood. So, to start with, let's take a couple minutes. I want us to read through the promise article on MDN. So let's take a couple minutes and do that. Go. A couple more minutes. Okay, so let's chat a little bit. Give me some things that you took out of that article about promises. Volunteers. Yeah, Jackson.
They're a proxy for future value.
Yes. So somebody asks you what a promise is. You can say proxy. If you want to sound like a cool, down-to-earth person, you can say it represents an eventual value. That is probably what you should always lead with. A promise represents an eventual value. It's not the eventual value itself, it represents it. It gives us a means to program against something that we don't have yet. Cool. Give me something else you took away. Yeah, Jeremiah.
It's also represent the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation. So it's representing like different possible paths.
Yep. You can handle the success or failure of it. It's generally used for asynchronous things. It doesn't have to be, though. We'll see that later. But that's why promises were invented. Cool. What else did you take out of that article? Yeah.
I feel like I see resolved more than I do other things in terms of what it says.
Mm-hmm.
And that means, I wasn't clear, but it seems like that meant it was whatever the promise was like, it's almost like it was good to go within a chain. Like resolved applies to when there's things coming after it as well, but I wasn't sure.
So resolved is an example of the three different whats of promises. States. So we have three different states a promise can be in. Resolved is one of them. What are the other two? Pending or rejected.
They also said fulfilled, and then they made the distinction between resolved and fulfilled.
Fulfilled would be resolved or rejected. But it's done at that point. And what's important to note about that is that once a promise has been resolved or rejected, it can't go back to being pending, ever. It is pending, and then it's one of those two, and then it's done.
Does that apply with each one in the train, or is that?
Correct. Other things you took out of that article? You know, one of you said this a second ago, and it's probably more profound than maybe you intended it, but a promise is an object. So we're starting to figure out at this point that objects kind of come in a lot of shapes and sizes in JavaScript. What are some things you can think of that are objects? DOM node. A DOM node is an object. It's a type of object. What else?
Array.
An array is a type of object. What else? Yep. So we can just use an object directly. Window isn't a particular type of object, but it is one.
Class instance.
So let's see. Yeah, that would be like making a, we'll call that like custom. How about function? Functions are objects. And want to see some fucking crazy?
Yeah.
To prove it, let's say some function equals hey. So I can do something like some function and then invoke it. We know that, right? You know I can also do some function, some property equals storing stuff on object.
What?
No way.
And then I can still invoke some function,
What?
and I can also look up some property that I stored on it,
What?
because it's just an object.
Yes. that's
Why?
sick.
Why?
Is there any like good reason you?
Why do you do that?
Yes, there's a great reason why you might do that. Beyond the scope of this program, really, but the answer is a thing called memoization. Has anybody stumbled across that before? Know what memoization is?
We can do that with raise 2, is that right? Like kind of similar?
You pretty much always memorize a function, not any other data structure. What is memoization?
Is it like a tooltip?
Nope, good guess.
Store the results of expensive function calls, return the cache result.
Exactly.
That's great.
So if I have a pure function, which means it's deterministic, if I give it this input, it always generates this output. Well, the calculation to generate that output might be expensive. And if I'm doing that multiple times, instead of running the calculation every time, I can look up in the memo, have I ever done this calculation before? And if so, what was the result? And if it's already been done, just return that. Or if it hasn't been done, calculate it and then store it in the memo. Magic.
Oh, that would make this so much faster.
So the like a common place where you'll see that get used is you're doing something like what is it? Calculating a Fibonacci sequence, or any of those kinds of like algorithm puzzles where like you run into Stack Overflows or those kinds of things. Anything that kind of has that like recursive nature to it. One of the hacks around that is instead of actually doing each little micro calculation every time you're adding these two things together, store it in a memo. And then you just get them for free once you've already calculated them. Pretty dope. Pretty dope. So that's why you would do that. But fundamentally, a function is just an object. Also, promise. Yeah.
Sorry to be out of scope, but is memoization like more of a functional thing or more of an object?
It is hardcore functional.
It's hardcore functional.
Okay, so all these things are different kinds of promise. Or different kinds of object. So promise is an object that represents an eventual value. Other things you took out of that promise article?
You can make more promises off of the results of the promise.
Yes, that is one of my favorite features of a promise. Anything that returns out of a promise handler is automatically also a promise. And this gets to this like, does it have to be async thing? Because let's say I fetch something and then I response.json, and then I have some function in here. I can do something that's not async at all in that. And none of these things need to be asynchronous. They just can be now. And when this was explained to me, exploded my brain, so might yours as well. A promise represents an eventual value. All right, well, 1 plus 1 equals 2. It also eventually equals 2.
What does that mean?
Right.
So, an async value will eventually be something. A constant value will also eventually be something. So if you think of passage of time, and I have the async thing and the synchronous thing, this ends up being nothing until enough time goes by, and then it becomes something. All right, well, the synchronous thing starts as something, and then eventually becomes the exact same thing. Fucking wild.
Did you call it consync or something like that? Consync?
Just sync.
Oh, I thought I heard you say.
Nope.
What's going on in the dots between 1 and 1 at the bottom?
Whatever the asynchronous, in this case, nothing. But if this were asynchronous, if I, for whatever reason, had an asynchronous addition function, this gives it time to process that. If it's already resolved, doesn't need it. So it just stays the same thing. And the reason why this is important, and this is beyond the scope of our objective here, but I think you might enjoy this anyway. It's a concept called lifting. So you've probably run into problems already with dancing back and forth between synchronous and asynchronous things, where I have some, let's see, we can use the same thing from over here. I'm in synchronous land, and then I need to hop over to asynchronous land, and then I need to come back to synchronous land, and then I need to do something else that's asynchronous, and then I'm back in synchronous land. That's common. We do that a lot in applications. So the solution is to make all of your synchronous stuff act like it's asynchronous. And now we can just handle everything with .thens. We treat them all like they're the same thing. Because it doesn't actually matter if they're asynchronous or not. But we can lift the synchronous stuff so that it acts like it's asynchronous. And then instead of trying to juggle back and forth between synchronous and asynchronous, .then. Much better. Cool. We're going to get concrete in just a sec. Any more ahas from reading that promise article?
Is .then is what encourages the lifting, like because you're pulling the synchronous functions?
Yes. So .then will either takes the return value of whatever the previous promise was. That can be synchronous, or that can be another promise, and it will resolve it and pass it into the next executor.
Could you dot then on a constant? Could you say like 2 parentheses dot then?
No, you can't, although there's a hack for that. So if I just need to start off a chain because the first part of it is synchronous, the magic trick is promise, capital P, dot resolve. And what that returns, what that evaluates to, is a resolved promise that you can dot then off of.
That's sick.
Yeah. In fact, this will work. I can console.log this whole thing. And if I do node promise.js, fuck. Oh, that's right, because it would need to be, because it needs to be in the chain for it to work. So you pass console.log there. And 2.
You just said console log, or you just said?
Because .then takes a function definition, and console.log is a function definition, because we can invoke it. The more you know. More questions about stuff you took out of that article, big picture questions about promises. Yeah.
What's like the time scope that promises work with? Like how long has to go by before it goes, or before it's rejected, or?
It'll go indefinitely. You can have a promise that takes half an hour to resolve, as far as I know. It also, if it's a synchronous value, it could return immediately. What we're saying is that it might not. Because a promise represents an eventual value. A synchronous value will also eventually be that. An asynchronous value needs time to resolve. Cool. What else?
Can you force resolve or reject a promise if it's impending? Like if it's returning promise pending?
Yeah, you could. I think you can pass a promise in to this. So I can do promise.resolve and then pass in some pending promise. There's no reason you would ever do that, but I think that technically works. Other questions? All right, so you've seen me do this before. This is like a bare bones Express app, right? Bring in the Express lab framework, we make an app with it, and we tell it to listen on port 9000. And when it's done setting up the listening, this is called a callback. That's the traditional way to handle asynchronous stuff in JavaScript. It takes a while for the system to do this. It doesn't want to block the execution of the rest of the application while it's doing that. So we give it a function that it will execute as soon as this is over. Callback. That's an important vocab word. A promise is an object. It represents an eventual value, and it's an alternative to callbacks. Solve all the exact same problems with it. By default, almost everything in Node is set up around callbacks. But we can also promisify callbacks. And that's where we're going to kind of peek under the hood at promises, because you haven't actually seen one yet. You've used fetch, which returns a promise, so we can .then off of it, but we've never actually made a promise before. Check this shit out. So I'm going to make a function, let's see how I want to handle this, called listen. And it's going to return a new promise. Anybody catch what this promise constructor takes as an argument?
Callback.
Nope. Good guess.
Just what it's going to resolve with.
Not quite.
Resolve reject.
Oh, you're right in the ballpark. That's the arguments to the thing that you're going to pass in.
Executor.
An executor. The promise constructor takes an executor, which is a function. So we're going to say, cool, here's a function definition that we're passing in, and the arguments to that are resolve and reject. The thing that's special about this executor is that we're not actually waiting for the function to return. That doesn't affect anything. What we're waiting for is resolve and reject are also functions. And we're waiting for one of those to get called, and that's what ends the function, not the use of the return keyword. So I can do some long async thing, and then whenever that comes back, I call resolve or reject, for example, in its callback. Like, for example, app.listen port 9000, and then in this callback, instead of doing the thing in there, I say, cool, resolve. Now the cool part. Now I can do listen dot then so say this is promisified. Spend a second looking at that. Show you one more thing that's kind of badass. That resolve function will accept an argument, and that ends up being the thing that comes back from the dot then. So what's powerful about the promise version versus the callback version is the promise version is a lot more code. Can anybody see what the benefit of it is?
You could manually code a reject.
Mm-hmm. We have a lot more like fine-grained control when we promisify something, but ultimately we promisify the callback thing, so we're still kind of limited to whatever constraints it has. What else might be an advantage of doing it this way?
Yeah, you can still carry out more functions if it's rejected.
Yes, we can, and we'll talk about rejections in a second. We can do that. What if in this callback, I'm not just console logging something, I'm doing something else that's asynchronous, also as a callback. Like,
Oh, maybe if you're changing constants outside the promise.
sure. Or I do a set timeout with something after a second. Okay, that's the same kind of thing. Set timeout takes a callback. Once this many milliseconds have elapsed, we call back that function. And then what if that needs to do something asynchronous also. So this could be everything from a fetch that depends on another fetch, that depends on another fetch, that depends on another fetch. Can anybody tell the part that sucks about this yet?
What's the largest function of your life?
Yeah. This is called, this has a name. Anybody know what it is?
Garbage.
It's on the, like, dreaded callback pyramid or something.
Yep, you got it. Callback hell or the pyramid of doom?
Yeah.
The real fat arrow.
Well done. Yeah, callback hell or the pyramid of doom. Sucks. So, versus if we promisify this, then I can say, if I do the exact same thing, set timeout, something cool.
Ooh,
That's the same thing in promises,
slick.
is slick.
That was purely just what it looks like on screen. Is that-
Because with callbacks, I have to nest them. If I need this thing to be done before this can start, it needs to be inside of its callback, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. Or, since this returns back from this promise handler, the result of that gets available here, but this needs to be finished before this goes. Ta-da. That's what's cool about promises. And Kat's earlier point, if I have something asynchronous that I did that didn't work out, for example, I think the second argument to listen is, all right, what if you're not able to start up the app? I can reject that like that. And then, let's see, if this was the argument that got passed into like the .then handler, any guesses what this argument, where that shows up? In the .catch handler. So now, I can put .catch there, handle that message, console.error message. Here's another dope thing about promise chains. So I say, cool, .then something else async. And cool. So I have all these async things. If you just throw on a .catch at the end of it, it will handle any rejection anywhere in this chain. If you get that error that's like, you encountered an unhandled promise rejection, that's how you fix it. That's it. That's all you have to do.
Can you pass other functions to continue your app? For example, like instead of a console logging the message, the error,
Mm-hmm.
you can just like throw another function in there?
Yes. That gets, That gets tricky, though. And the reason that gets tricky is once a promise has been rejected, you can't do it anymore. You can't go back and retry it, for example. That's not true in every language. Almost every language has some way to handle asynchronous behavior. Some of them will let you retry it in there. Promises don't. And so usually what you're doing is saying, okay, if this entire thing was wrapped in a function and it fails somewhere in there, in my catch, I might retry the entire function to start the chain over again. Here's another cool thing about dot catches. You have multiple catches. So this will catch anything that threw an error in here. This will catch anything that threw an error in here. See if you have slightly different cases for each of them. It's pretty cool. Another common way to handle that, you can just pass in a second function definition to .then, and that'll handle the error also.
What else would you do with an error besides console log it?
Another common thing is if you have done some work in this chain already and then you hit an error, you might want to roll back the changes that you made rather than like having a partial change. You might do something like redirect a user to an error page. But yeah, you're either trying to notify a developer of what happened, or you're trying to put the application back in some kind of working state. More questions?
Is there a difference between catching the error and logging it versus your developer tools console logs the same thing, but in red text?
That's what console.error is, red text. You have console.log, console.warn, and console.error. Black, yellow, red.
Oh, okay. So console.log would be message, or error message would be the black one then?
Yes,
Okay.
correct.
I mean, I guess because if you don't put the dot catch, your console lets you know anyway.
Sometimes.
Oh.
Sometimes it also swallows it. And if it's so in this case, we explicitly rejected this and threw the error. Something that will also happen is if anything in the application throws like an error object. Hey, it's another kind of object. It's actually slightly different. The error object has a method called message. And so this becomes error. That's the actual thing that it got. And then you report on error.message. But like the error object also has the stack trace of the thing through the error and that kind of shit. So you might want to log that or write that back to a database or something like that. Like if you have some kind of user bug tracking database, maybe in your catch handler, every time that fires, it sends off a fetch request to your database. It's like, by the way, one of your users had this error. More questions?
Can you explain how that second function works for the error handler?
Yeah.
How you set that up?
.then takes either one function definition or two function definitions. If you give it two, this is what will run if the thing before it was successful. this is the thing that will run if the thing before it was not successful. And by successful, I mean either resolve was called, or reject was called, or it threw an error somewhere. More questions? Cool. Now that we've talked about this a little bit, I'm going to put a couple more minutes on the clock again. I want you to go back to the exact same article and read it now that we have a little bit more context and now that we've gotten to have a discussion about this. I think some of these words might be a little more meaningful. So a couple more minutes, go. Okay, questions that came out from your second read on that?
Finally, have you ever?
Yep.
used that?
So finally is a way, I don't think it's actually standardized yet, but the point of finally is whether or not it resolved or rejected. If there's something you want to do in either case, you can dot finally. Let me check can I use on that, because I don't think that's very broadly supported. Promise.prototype.finally. It's actually better than I thought. There you go. There's one more promise method that you should know exists, and that's promise.all. Promise.all is fucking rad. So I can say fetch response.json. Okay, let's say I have 4 of those. Oops, actually. So I have these 4 fetch calls. The thing that comes back from this is a promise. So I have 4 pending promises here. With promise.all, it takes an array of promises. So I can do something like that. Come on, don't be a jerk. Don't make me look dumb in front of my friends. Okay, so I take an array of promises, you pass them into promise.all. Watch this shit. Promise.all returns a promise with all the results. And so then you have like these are the results of like each of those fetch calls. But you get a lot more performance benefit because you fire all 4 of them at the same time.
Do you mean results like resolved or rejected? Is that what you mean?
No, I mean whatever came back from this fetch once it was parsed. So this is Pokemon 1, Pokemon 2, Pokemon 3, Pokemon 4. I say I want to fire all those requests at the same time, and that is the JSON, or the objected JSON, parsed JSON for Pokemon 1, Pokemon 2, Pokemon 3, Pokemon 4. Yeah, Jeremiah.
So if you were running something like Facebook that had just a ton of data that had to fetch right when you logged into your account, but
Mhm.
you could use that.
Exactly. Those if those fetches don't depend on each other, they just all need to happen at some point, then fire them all off at the same time.
That's sick.
Is sick.
So you could fetch like the same data, just like split it up so you don't have just one huge fetch that way?
You don't really get any performance benefit from doing that, but if you're doing something like a mashup, which is like multiple APIs combined into one useful thing, you put all those API calls, and then okay, so what I want you to do now, last thing we'll do with this, is I want you to, our objective was to explain how promises work. We'll see how well you can do this. So I want you to write down everything you know about promises. We're gonna take 5 minutes. Don't feel bad if it was like, but I was listening, I swear to God I was paying attention, I don't remember anything. It's illusion of competence. It's exactly why we're doing this. Go. You can use your notes, but like rewrite it. I want physical action happening. Jack got hired. he's 0. He got, yeah, go Chad!
What's his capstone?
Who fucking remembers? Got a job at Tree Laura with Carrie.
That's
Which is adorable.
I remember him, that's why.
Adorable.
He's the one who looks like Kevin but isn't Kevin.
No.
God, how do you spell his stupid last name? Sypek? There, that's it. Sypek. That guy.
I've seen his photo on LinkedIn. That same one.
There you go.
I've ever seen him.
He was in D0 with Jared. I'm gonna tell Brian. Another one gets a job. And Carrie is fantastic. Thanks again for your recommendation. On the day's work. Cool. So as you're trying to wrestle this concept, and also, by the way, a very difficult concept. This is one of those ones that once you get it, you'll never forget it. But don't be surprised if this one takes a couple weeks to really kind of settle in. It's abstract AF. As you're trying to wrestle this abstract AF concept into words, any challenges come up? Yeah.
Yeah, so the value of a fulfilled promise
Mhm.
is a function, and then like it would be like the result of that function would be the actual value of the fulfilled promise.
Not quite, almost. You use the .then method of a promise, which accepts a function, and the argument passed into that is the resolved value.
So what is a promise without document?
It's literally the promise object. It has some properties on it. It has a state of pending or resolved or rejected. It has methods on it, like .then and .catch, but it's the actual object.
So .then is a method that you run on the
Correct.
promise object. Dang.
So if I do some promise equals new promise, oops, like that, oops. Stop being difficult. Don't make me look dumb in front of my friends. Okay, so do some promise, takes a function, resolve, reject, and then we just resolve it right away. And we pass in hey. Okay, so I've made some promise here. If I take a look at some promise, if I try to log that, you get a promise object. It has a state, it has a value. And if we look on the prototype, hey, look at these methods. Then finally, it's constructor, catch.
So a promise is never like it would, even if it's fulfilled, it's not like doing anything else.
Correct. So if I want to get hey, the thing that promise resolved to, I need to do some promise, I need to do .then. This is going to expect a function, passes that as it's a parameter to this new function, and I could do something like log it. Oops. So log message, and that gives me hey. That's how I pull that value out.
So this isn't like directly related to that, but
Mhm.
is there some way to get a value out of asynchronous code into your synchronous code, or outside of just making it all asynchronous?
No, you have to go that direction. Because with your synchronous code, it's always going to do, it's actually kind of interesting, I think. Synchronous, done, done. Now this original call, that's synchronous, so that happens right away, but this callback isn't, so it keeps going. Function definition, neat, defines all these things. And then it'll invoke listen synchronously, won't do any of this other stuff. Then it defines fetch 1, fetch 2, fetch 3, fetch 4. Those are synchronous. And then it'll fire off promise.all, but it's not going to do any of this other stuff. Okay, so that's the first pass through the code, what the computer does. Next thing it does is it goes, cool. Any of those asynchronous things that we had going, are any of them ready to go? And so it'll go, cool. It'll do it based on what order they finish in, but something like this. Is this ready to go? Cool. If it is, then we can execute that. All right. What about this .then? Listen returned a promise. Is it ready to go yet? Was resolve called yet? It wasn't. Okay, that's fine. You're not going to do anything else in that promise chain. What about down here? Was any of these ready to start resolving? All right, cool. Then I'm going to do that. Then I'm going to do that. These two aren't really ready to go yet, but we're waiting for all of them to come back. And we go, okay, cool. Something else async came back. And so then we can do that one. This one was secretly synchronous. There's no other synchronous stuff left, so we're going to do that. There's no errors. All right, fetch 2 and fetch 4 came back. And since all 4 of those promises are ready, promise.all resolves. Now we can do this dot then. That's the nature of asynchronous code. It does every synchronous thing it can first, and then it starts waiting to see what else it can resolve asynchronously. But that's the entire reason that when I had that promise where I was just returning 1 plus 2. Let's take a look at that again. So I do const some promise, new promise, resolve, reject, and here I resolve it with 1 plus 2. If I console log some promise, what do I get back? You get the promise object. You don't get 3. And you might have noticed too that when I did this, I don't think that works. That might work actually. This outer console log thing that I'm doing, I'm logging that promise chain, not the result of it. What I really need to do is once all of these things have been resolved, then that can execute. If I try to do console.log, which is synchronous before that, all I'm going to get is a pending promise.
So it's not the dot then that creates another promise, it's the object that you pass through that is the promise. Oh, okay.
Yes. So some promise so I can do whatever I want in here. I called this dot then method on the promise that I made. I have access to the resolved value right there. And coolest part of this is whatever I return out of this, that gets promisified. So now I have some message. That's this lifting idea. Even though this is synchronous, doesn't matter. But it could also be asynchronous. I can also return a fetch out of that. And it'll wait for that promise to resolve and then make the response available in the next one. That's baller, yeah.
So is it possible to run a method on the promise object before it's fulfilled, or only when it's fulfilled?
What you're saying with .then and .catch is when this promise is fulfilled, if it was successful, call this. If it was not, call this.
Okay, so theoretically, you could add a method to the promise object in kind of a monkey patch kind of way that you could run in,
Yeah.
even if it's not fulfilled.
Look at you using words. See, I have this promise saved in some promise here. It's just an object though. So I can do some value or some method.
Sick.
Yeah, I can do whatever I want. It's my object. What else? If you'd be so kind, please send me what you wrote for your promise explanation. If you wrote it by hand, just snap a picture and Slack it over to me. And hopefully now you can explain how promises work. Bye-bye, folks. Bye-bye.